Well, you moved down a little bit. Thank you very much. After almost 5 complete days of UniverCity, I think we're going to expect this to continue on and on. It's going to be a little disappointing next week to find out that we can't continue our habit. At least we have tomorrow night one more speaker, keynoter, astronaut Sally Ride, and she will either be in the Forum tent or here in Emmons, and she will help us reach for the stars. So I encourage you to come for the last night of UniverCity. I'm Susan Harmon, and I'm pleased to be here to welcome you to tonight's event to hear Martin Goldsmith. I want you to know that Martin's visit with us is made possible by the generosity of Bessie and Benjamin Ziegler Foundation. We thank them very much for sponsoring this evening. Great. After Martin's talk, he will take questions and answers, and these mics here are to make that possible. And then if you have a book of his that you want to have signed, come on over here and he'll be happy to sign it for you. It's very appropriate that we have a radio person tonight, because you may know that today celebrates the College of Communication, Information, and Media. That's kind of one of the themes of the day. But Martin is bigger than just the College of Communication, because he's a musician and a great communicator about music. So the School of Music has been very much involved in this day, and my expectation is that we have a lot of musicians in the audience. Now, like many Ball State University graduates, past and present, Martin started his career in the Midwest. He was a classical music host at WCLV in Cleveland. Then he went on to public radio. If you are a public radio listener, and I assume the room is full of public radio listeners, you have heard him, oh yes, let's hear all that. That's my connection to Martin, so having worked together in public radio for many years, so of course I'm a big advocate. If you have listened to Indiana Public Radio through the years, you have had Martin in your car and in your home as the 10-year host of Performance Today. He is now head of classical music for XM Satellite Radio. This is a great new position for him. He graduated from Johns Hopkins University, and he is a musician. He's a French hornist and a singer. Now, to set the stage for this talk, let me ask you just to imagine a couple of things for me. Imagine that you are young, that you're in love, that you love music, that you're an enthusiastic and ambitious performer. Your friends and colleagues are leaving the community. You're fearful. Even more diminishing, you can only shop for your groceries at a certain part of the day, and your radios are ultimately confiscated, taken away from you. Those are just some of the elements of this amazing story that Martin is going to be talking about tonight. It's a story that connects music and politics and performance, family, community, identity, all themes that are right up the alley of UniverCity. So join me in welcoming Martin Goldsmith.
Thank you. It is terrific to be back in the Midwest, terrific to be back in Muncie, Indiana. I've told some people that this is my second visit to your fair city. The first one was 9 years ago when I was driving back from Spillville, Iowa. I was taking part in the 100th anniversary celebration surrounding Antonin Dvorak's trip to Spillville, Iowa in 1893, and on the way back it seemed only natural that I should make Muncie another stop on my itinerary. I look forward very much to speaking to you about the subject of my book, but with your indulgence, I'd like to begin by reading the opening chapter of the book because it puts certain things in context. The book begins this way. The first scene of the opera Die Walküre, the second of the 4 operas making up Richard Wagner's Ring cycle, takes place in the house of Hunding a fierce warlord. The central feature of Hunding's house is a mighty ash tree, its trunk soaring up from the floor, its branches forming a canopy over the roof. Embedded in the massive trunk is a golden sword the god Wotan has left for his son, the hero Sigmund, to find and wield at his hour of need. In the house where I grew up with my father, my mother, and my brother, there was also an enormous tree growing up through the roof, its great trunk dominating the enclosed space. In many ways, we shared a perfectly ordinary family life. My father spoke to my mother tucked me in at night, my brother and I played with each other when we weren't fighting. But none of us ever acknowledged the tree. The tree wasn't real, of course, but its impact on my family was overwhelming. The effort it required for all of us not to take conscious notice of it was also huge. This enormous presence in our house was the fate of my parents' families, Jews who lived in Germany in the 1930s, and my parents' escape from that fate. Their story, so similar to and yet so different from the 6 million other stories of that time and place, affected everything these two people did. It was at the root of their lives and grew ever upward as they grew older. And, as in so many other families like ours, it was something we never spoke of. Not that I was completely unaware of the tree and the shadow it cast on our house. When my friends talked about visiting their grandparents at Thanksgiving or going to the ball game with Uncle Ed, I knew that something from the past had made similar excursions impossible for me. And returning to our house following an afternoon of playing in the neighborhood, I was often conscious of taking off my own real personality, hanging it up in the closet with my jacket, and donning a sort of internal costume that would enable me to blend in with the emotional scenery. But again, we never spoke of such things. Let me hasten to say that such talk was never overtly forbidden. By no means was I or my brother ever shushed when we attempted to steer the conversation in certain directions. We simply never made such attempts. As a family, we didn't discuss what had happened in Germany for the same reason that we didn't discuss bauxite mining in Peru. They were both subjects that simply did not exist for us. Nor do I want to give the impression of a dark and gloomy household where silence reigned. Not at all. Life revolved around my mother's activities as a musician, a violist, first as a member of the St. Louis Symphony and later as a member of the Cleveland Orchestra, and that meant that there was always music in the house. My parents' friends and colleagues would often come by for after-concert parties when the house would resound with music and laughter. But every year the tree grew taller. And as I grew older, I came to be more and more aware of its presence and of how odd it was that we never spoke of it, since it dominated the landscape. Its leaves turned yellow and drifted to the ground when my mother died in 1984. The tree itself remained, however, casting its prodigious shadow over my relationship with my father. Finally, as we both grew more aware of the ever-quickening passage of time, I decided to do something about it. In 1992, the year I turned 40, I was traveling in Europe, while my father, who was nearly 79, was also in Europe with his new love, Emily Irwin. We arranged to meet in Oldenburg, my father's hometown. We visited his childhood home, and he told me something of his memories of that long-ago time. He took me to where his father's store had been, and told me that Nazi thugs had organized a boycott of the store in April 1933, an action that led to his father's having to sell the family house. He showed me the Pferdemarkt, the horse market, where his father had been taken following his arrest in November 1938. Slowly, those shadowy figures, my grandparents, whom I'd never known, began to take on human form. And for the first time, my father and I began to take notice of that huge tree in our house. It wasn't a fast process by any means. A year later, while visiting my father in Tucson, I tried to get him to talk more about his youth. He spoke only briefly, however, and quickly moved the conversation on to something else. It was obvious that he found these trips into the past to be very painful. But I persisted in my efforts to talk to him about those days, believing that coming to terms with them would somehow benefit both him and our relationship. And that visit to Tucson resulted in something extraordinary. He agreed to come to Washington, D.C. and tour with me the newly opened United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. A few days before my father's arrival, I happened to mention our plan to Alex Chadwick, a friend of mine at National Public Radio. Alex asked if he could come along with a microphone and record my father's reactions. Both my father and I agreed, and in late January 1994, the three of us visited the museum. Those hours marked a turning point in my father's life and in our relationship. At first, I thought I had made a terrible mistake in asking him to come to the museum. To tour the permanent exhibition, you enter an elevator that takes you up to the top floor, from which you slowly walk back down to ground level. When we stepped out of the elevator, the first image that met my father's eyes was a huge photograph of General Eisenhower touring a concentration camp after the war, surrounded by the skeletal remains of former prisoners. My father gasped and tried to get back into the elevator, but the doors had already closed. Alex and I steadied him, and we made our way through the rest of the museum. The names and faces, the piles of shoes and eyeglasses, the cattle car, and an oboe played by the man who had sat right next to my father in the Berlin Jüdische Kulturbund orchestra. My father took it all in and spoke very little. But the next day he came to NPR and recorded an interview with Alex, trying, he said, to explain the unexplainable. Alex prepared a feature for NPR's morning edition, and suddenly people all over America began calling my father to tell him that they had been moved by his story. He, in turn, was moved by their interest. Having lived in silence with his thoughts and his memories for so long, he had come to feel isolated from other people. Now those people were reaching out to him, and the effect was transforming for both of us. He now felt more at ease with his past and with me. I had always felt distanced from him, but now I saw him in a different light, less as someone who had deliberately shut me out, and more as someone who had heroically overcome the horrors of the Third Reich to establish a normal and rich life in a foreign land. We became good friends, and we began to talk about his early years in Germany. The more I learned, the more I respected him, and the more I learned about myself as well. I discovered an important source of my feelings for music. It's beautiful and moving, of course, but music also literally saved my parents' lives. Had they not been members of an all-Jewish orchestra, maintained at the pleasure of Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda, they would never have made it out of Germany alive. During their years in Berlin, before their escape, my parents frequently risked everything by defying the Nazi curfews so that they could play chamber music with their friends. As I heard my father tell me his story, I came to realize that somehow I had inherited the knowledge that music can not only enrich your life, it is also something worth risking your life for. I came to see that my chosen profession has been no accident. Maybe, in fact, it chose me. I learned that the tree growing in our house, like the ash tree in the house of Hunding, also contained a golden sword buried deep within its trunk. My parents' story of music and courage and persistence and luck was no weapon, but it has proven to be a source of great strength and inspiration for me. By sharing his life, my father has enabled me to extract and possess a rich treasure of understanding and hope. That's how the book begins, and there follows the story of my parents and their families, and of this extraordinary organization that my parents were a part of, the Jüdische Kulturbund, the Jewish Cultural Association, an organization that came about as a result of what the Nazis did in the weeks and months following Adolf Hitler's becoming Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933. The Nazis had many things on their plate, many things they hoped to accomplish in the first weeks of their rule, but one of the first things they did do was to begin systematically kicking Jews out of their positions with German orchestras, opera companies, and theater companies, until by April of 1933, there were about 8,000 unemployed Jewish artists in Germany. And some of them came together in the late spring and early summer of 1933 to form this Kulturbund, this cultural association, reasoning that if they could no longer make art for their fellow Germans, they could at least make art for their fellow German Jews. They appointed to be their spokesperson a man by the name of Kurt Singer, who up until January 1933 had been the assistant director of the Berlin City Opera. Kurt Singer was a fascinating man. He was trained as a neurologist and a psychiatrist. He was the conductor of his own chorus. He was a theater director. He was an author. He was the veteran of the First World War. And he took it upon himself to become the artistic director of this nascent organization, the Kulturbund. He was quite a figure, according to people who knew him and who left memories of him. He was very dynamic. Somebody remembered him this way: he had dramatic looks with a surge of gray hair rippling back from his forehead, an imposing lithe figure, a wickedly seductive face. There's a picture of the wickedly seductive face of Kurt Singer in the book. And he quickly decided that the organization probably wouldn't get very far unless it had official Nazi sanction. So he began knocking on the doors of various Nazi ministries until he came upon a man by the name of Hans Hinkel. In 1933, Hans Hinkel had been a member of the National Socialists for 10 years already. He was actually at Adolf Hitler's side in November of 1923 during the infamous beer hall putsch in Munich. Hans Hinkel thought of himself as being something of a cultured man, and so he agreed to become the Nazi liaison to the Kulturbund. Not, I hasten to mention, because either Hans Hinkel or his boss, Joseph Goebbels, had any interest in furthering Jewish culture. They saw the Kulturbund from the beginning as a very convenient tool for their aims, for two primary reasons. On the one hand, the Nazis looked forward to the day that German society would become, in their word, Judenrein, or free of Jews. And the idea that there would be a separate Jewish artistic organization putting on plays and concerts off by themselves very much was in concert with their hope to segregate Jews from mainstream German society. And secondly, and even more important to Joseph Goebbels, the master of propaganda, he could deflect international criticism of Germany's treatment of its Jews, such as it was, by saying, in effect, how bad can it be for the Jews? Look, they have their own orchestra, they have their own opera company. Obviously, we're treating them just fine. So from the very beginning, the Kulturbund operated with the express consent and encouragement of the Nazis. The Kulturbund put on plays, they put on operas, they put on concerts, orchestra concerts, chamber concerts. They showed films, they sponsored lectures, they eventually published a newspaper, all for the Jews of Germany. In order to perform with the Kulturbund, to be a musician or an actor or a singer, or to build sets or costumes backstage, to take tickets in the box office, even to clean the lavatories, you had to be Jewish. To attend Kulturbund performances, you had to be Jewish. If you were married and your spouse was not Jewish, he or she was forbidden from attending Kulturbund performances. I spoke to a number of former members of the Kulturbund, people who remembered performances, and to a person they all remembered that for every performance the hall was always packed. The Kulturbund became the only place where the Jews of Germany could go to attend a performance. Within a very short time after 1933, it became illegal for a Jew to buy a ticket to attend a concert by the Berlin Philharmonic, or to even buy a ticket to the local Bijou to watch a film in Hamburg or Stuttgart or Freiburg or Cologne. The Kulturbund was it for the Jews of Germany, the one place where they could come on a Thursday evening or a Sunday afternoon and attend a concert, see a film, and spend a few precious hours away from the increasing ugliness and danger of the German streets. The Kulturbund raised its curtain for the first time in Berlin on October 1st, 1933, during the high holy days of that year, with a play called Nathan der Weise, Nathan the Wise, by an 18th century German playwright named Gotthold Lessing. Ironically enough, the play Nathan the Wise is all about religious toleration. It was a big success that evening, perhaps too big a success, because October 1st, 1933 was the first and last time that Nathan the Wise was ever performed in Nazi Germany. Everything the Kultur do, anything that Kurt Singer conceived of, he had to run by Hans Hinkel and Joseph Goebbels and the Nazi censors. From the very beginning, Singer was savvy enough to realize it probably didn't make a lot of sense to perform any music by Richard Wagner or Richard Strauss, a couple of composers whom the Nazis held in very high regard. But from the beginning, the Kulturbund was allowed to perform music by German composers, Beethoven, Bach, Brahms, Schumann. But within a couple of years, the Gestapo ruled that for a German musician to perform Beethoven, for instance, or a German actor to speak the words of Goethe or Schiller, was to defile this great German art. And the word came down from above that henceforth it was illegal for the Kulturbund to perform any German art. A few years after that, in 1938, after the Anschluss, the takeover of Austria, Austrian composers, Mozart, Haydn, Schubert, were added to the banned list, leaving the Kulturbund able to perform music by Jewish composers, Mendelssohn, Mahler, and all the foreign-born musicians, composers, and playwrights that they wanted. Moliere and Shakespeare were particularly important to the acting troupe of the Kulturbund. As I say, the Kulturbund began in Berlin on October 1st, 1933, but by the end of that year, there were branch organizations in, the first organization opened up in Cologne, and by 1936, there were Kulturbund organizations in 49 cities across Germany, and about 70,000 people were members of the Kulturbund. And they did some first-rate work with some first-rate artists. After all, the people who joined the Kulturbund were by and large those artists who had been kicked out of great German orchestras, opera companies, and theater companies. The string section of the Berlin Kulturbund Orchestra alone had 8 former concertmasters from orchestras around Germany. The conductor of the Kulturbund Orchestra in Frankfurt was a man by the name of Hans Wilhelm Steinberg. Herr Steinberg later emigrated first to Palestine and then to the United States, and under the name William Steinberg, he first assisted Toscanini at the NBC Orchestra in New York, and later became the music director and conductor of the Buffalo Philharmonic, the Pittsburgh Symphony, and the Boston Symphony Orchestra. William Steinberg, one of the most important American conductors of the last part of the 20th century. The violist Boris Kreutz was a member of the Kulturbund. He later came to this country and played the viola in the Budapest String Quartet for many years in residence at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. The actors Jenny Bernstein and Alfred Berliner were members of the Kulturbund. They had some first-rate artists performing with them, and they did some first-rate work. The first production ever in Germany of the play Six Characters in Search of an Author by Luigi Pirandello was a Kulturbund production. The first time that Verdi's opera Nabucco was ever performed in Germany, it was a production by the Kulturbund. So they did some really first-rate work, always under the watchful eye of the Nazi censors. My mother was 18 years old in 1935 when she joined the Kulturbund. Her father was the director of a music conservatory in the German city of Düsseldorf, and he had made music with Hans Wilhelm Steinberg once or twice before, and he arranged for my mother to play audition for Herr Steinberg. He invited her to join the orchestra, and on September 10th, 1935, she gave her first performance with the Kulturbund Orchestra of Frankfurt. September 10th, 1935 is not a particularly important date in German history, but just 5 days after that came, naturally enough, September 15th, 1935, the date that saw the passage of the infamous Nuremberg laws, the laws that essentially stripped the Jews of Germany of their citizenship and did lots of other nasty things besides that. My father, who was 22 years old at the time, was studying the flute in the German city of Karlsruhe at the time of the Nuremberg laws, and he was asked to leave that organization for what were termed racial reasons. So in the fall of 1935, my father decided that he'd had enough and was going to leave the country of his birth, and over the next weeks and months made arrangements to move to Stockholm. He found himself an apartment over a milk bar in Stockholm and determined that he would live out the rest of his life as a Swedish citizen. And he was all set to move to Sweden in March of 1936 when the phone rang in his apartment, and a fellow at the other end of the phone asked him if he would be able to fill in at short notice for a flutist who had come down with a very bad cold. Could, this fellow asked my father, play a couple of concerts with the Kulturbund Orchestra of Frankfurt? At first, my father tried to get out of that responsibility, saying that he was about to move to Sweden, but eventually he decided to agree. He threw his flute and a few other things into a suitcase, took the train from Karlsruhe up to Frankfurt, and played those two concerts, one in Frankfurt and one in Hamburg, and then duly moved off to Sweden. But he couldn't forget the lovely young violist he met during those two concerts. A correspondence ensued between Frankfurt and Stockholm, and when the same flutist who had gotten sick in March emigrated to Palestine in August, my father moved back from the safety of Sweden to Nazi Germany to be with the woman who would later become his wife and my mother. Again, with your indulgence, I'd like to read just a couple of paragraphs about that part of the story. My father's name was Gunther Goldschmidt. My mother's name was Rosemary Gumpert at the time. And the major work on that program that they gave twice, one in Frankfurt and one in Hamburg, was the fabulous Pathétique Symphony, the Symphony No. 6 by Tchaikovsky. The next day, just hours before leaving for Sweden, Gunther mailed Rosemary a copy of Rainer Maria Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet. I have the little volume before me now, a precious relic. On the first page is the following inscription, in German, naturally. Rosemary Gumpert, a small memento of two concerts, Tchaikovsky, in Frankfurt and Hamburg in March 1936. Signed, G.G. I wonder which of Rilke's gentle and profound observations made the greatest impression on the sender and on the recipient. More than 60 years later, two in particular strike me. Rilke wrote, "Destiny is like a wonderful wide tapestry in which every thread is guided by an unspeakably tender hand, placed beside another thread and held and carried by 100 others." And Rilke also wrote, "It is always my wish that you might find enough patience within yourself to endure and enough innocence to have faith. Believe me, life is right in all cases." A few days later, Gunther was thrilled to receive a return envelope from Frankfurt. Inside, he found an enthusiastic letter from Rosemary thanking him for the book and expressing her happiness at having met him. But she had addressed the letter to Gustav Goldschmidt, apparently confusing him with the King of Sweden. It must have been a wee bit exasperating for Gunther to think that he had made so little an impression upon the object of his affection that she couldn't even remember his name. But, having inherited my mother's occasional difficulties with such matters, I can only smile with love and indulgence. What, after all, is in a name? Thus began an ardent correspondence between Frankfurt and Stockholm. Believing, as did Rilke, in a beautifully woven destiny and in the rightness of life, Gunther, after spending 6 months in the white night safety of Sweden and engaging in a regular and intense correspondence with Rosemary, decided to go back to Germany to be near her. Foolishly, or romantically, or both, my father accepted the position of principal flutist of the Frankfurt Kulturbund Orchestra. Would I have done the same thing? Whatever my answer, I have the advantage of hindsight, of knowing the terrors of the next 10 years. But still, even in the late summer of 1936, my father must have known what a damn fool thing he was doing, deliberately, and with all his faculties intact, voluntarily going back to Nazi Germany, to the country whose leader had vowed to eradicate his kind from the earth forever. And for what? Ah, for love and music. I don't know if I would have done it, but I do know that I love and admire him for it. I think it's the most wonderful story I know. So for the next couple of years, my parents played together on the same stage in Frankfurt, he in the flute section, she in the viola section. This was 1936, 1937, 1938. By this time, more and more Jews began to leave Germany for other parts of the globe, which resulted, of course, in fewer Jews being left in Germany to perform with the Kulturbund and fewer Jews remaining to attend Kulturbund performances. And slowly, one by one, the branch organizations, the ones outside of Berlin, were shut down. And that is what happened to the Kulturbund in Frankfurt. My parents played their last concert with the Frankfurt Kulturbund Orchestra in April of 1938. They then joined the home office, so to speak, by moving to Berlin to play with the Berlin Kulturbund. They arrived in Berlin in time to take part in what was apparently a wonderful production of Verdi's Rigoletto. They performed down in the pit, of course, throughout the month of October 1938. The production came down at the very end of October. My mother then decided to go back to spend some time with her family in Düsseldorf, and my father decided to stay in Berlin and practice his flute for a little while longer, anticipating the first rehearsal of the Berlin Kulturbund Orchestra, which was scheduled to give its first performance in mid-November. And that is how matters stood on November 9th, 1938, the night remembered as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, when German thugs roamed the border, roamed the country, smashing the windows of Jewish-owned businesses, setting synagogues afire, dragging Jews out into the street and stomping them many times to death. My father managed to make his way out of the apartment he was living in Berlin and make his way down to the Zoological Garden train station in Berlin, where he managed to catch a train heading west. And he traveled all that night until he arrived the following morning, November 10th, in Düsseldorf, where he walked through the still very dangerous streets of Düsseldorf until he came to number 17 Boltensternstrasse, where my mother lived with her parents. My father hid out in their attic for the next couple of days until the worst of the danger was past. After about a month, my parents decided to get married, and they did indeed get married on December 13th, 1938. They were married by the Justice of the Peace of Düsseldorf. He was wearing the brown uniform of the SS. The marriage took place in his office, which was decorated by a full-length portrait of Der Führer, Adolf Hitler, who was gazing out over the mountains of Berchtesgaden, his hand resting on the noble head of a German shepherd. That was the primary decoration for my parents' wedding. They then went back to Berlin and played in the Berlin Orchestra for the next couple of years, 1939, 1940. During this time, more and more restrictions had been levied against the Jews of Germany, as Sue Harmon mentioned earlier. At various times throughout the 1930s, it became illegal for a Jew to own a radio. Jews' driver's licenses were declared invalid. It became illegal for Jews to own pets. It became illegal for Jews to shop before 4 p.m., and stores always closed at 5. There were curfews levied against the Jews. If you were Jewish, you had to be off the street by 8 p.m. during the wintertime, 9 p.m. during the summer. But my parents, as I alluded to in the opening chapter of the book, would often disregard the curfew because they loved playing chamber music. And they loved disregarding not only the chamber music law, but the law against playing Beethoven by getting together with friends and playing Beethoven quartets behind closed doors and drawn curtains. And often after these chamber music, informal chamber music gatherings, it was well past curfew, and my parents would sneak through the streets back to their apartment at number 93 Prinzenstrasse. I guess knowing that if they were caught, they would instantly be sent somewhere very unpleasant, but they chose to take the risks nonetheless. And because they had immersed themselves in this wonderful chamber music community, they were invited to perform a series of concerts at, of all places, the American Embassy in Berlin, where they met a young woman my father remembers only as Mrs. Schneider. And Mrs. Schneider was very helpful to my parents in filling out the correct forms, which enabled them to apply for a visa. They applied in 1940, and it wasn't until a year later, February 1941, February 27th, 1941, to be exact, is when their visa arrived. On the very day, as it happens, that the Kulturbund Orchestra, the remains of the Kulturbund Orchestra, by this time, February of 1941, it was becoming something of a ragtag operation, but they gathered together all of their strength and all of their faculties and all of their inspiration to perform one of the greatest symphonies ever composed, the Symphony No. 2 by Gustav Mahler, known as the Resurrection Symphony, which is all about pain and suffering and eventually great joy at seeing God. And on that very day that the Kulturbund Orchestra gave that performance of the Resurrection Symphony, my parents came home and found that their precious visas had arrived. They then spent the next several weeks securing passage on a ship to America. And they were lucky enough to book passage on the good ship Mugino, which left Lisbon on June 10th, 1941, the second to last boat leaving Lisbon with Jewish refugees. They arrived in New York City, pulling up underneath the beautiful Statue of Liberty on the 21st of June, 1941, quite literally just in time. Fewer than 3 months after that, on September 1st, 1941, the Nazis revived the medieval practice of forcing the Jews of Germany to wear the yellow star. And 10 days after that, September 11th, 1941, the Nazis summarily dissolved the Kulturbund. It was of no longer of any use to them. As far as its being a propaganda tool, by this time the Nazis had been conducting their propaganda on the battlefield for the previous 2 years. And as far as making Germany Judenrein, by this time, September 1941, the idea of Jews off in a corner somewhere putting on plays and concerts was a very primitive reminder of early solutions to what was termed the Jewish problem. By September 1941, a final solution to the problem was being readied, and the Kulturbund was therefore seen as being of no further use to the Nazis, and it was summarily dissolved, again on September 11th, 1941. And all members of the organization who had not yet managed to get out of Germany were sent to the camps. So my parents were extraordinarily fortunate to have arrived in this country just in time, where they were able to, over the next number of years, make very good lives for themselves. My mother continued her musical career. My father did for a while. My mother continued playing with the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra for 21 years and the Cleveland Orchestra for 14 years after that. So they were extraordinarily fortunate, much more so than the rest of their families. On November 9th, 1938, my father's father, Alex Goldschmidt, who since 1911 had run a woman's clothing store in Oldenburg. It was called Alex Goldschmidt Haus der Mode, Alex Goldschmidt House of Fashion. My grandfather, Alex, was arrested on the night of November 9th, was taken to the Pferdemarkt, the horse market, the main square in Oldenburg, made to stay there overnight. The following morning, November 10th, he and 42 other adult male Jews of Oldenburg were marched through the city streets, past the still smoldering remains of the synagogue on Peterstrasse, to the prison in Oldenburg, where he and his 42 fellow Jews spent the night in prison for the crime of being born Jewish. The next morning, they were taken to the train station of Oldenburg and placed on a train headed east to the concentration camp Sachsenhausen, where my grandfather remained for the next 3 weeks, after which he was released with the understanding that he had 6 months to leave the country or else face further arrest. So over the next 6 months, he made arrangements to leave Germany with his younger son, my father's younger brother. The plan was that they would establish a beachhead in the Western Hemisphere, in Cuba, and then send for the rest of the family. But it was their ill fortune to book passage on the infamous refugee ship known as the St. Louis, which left Hamburg in May of 1939, bound for Havana. It in fact reached Havana Harbor safely, only to discover that power plays in the upper reaches of the Cuban government made it impossible for the more than 900 Jewish refugees on board the St. Louis to land. The ship then weighed anchor and sailed north to the coast of the United States, where it plied the waters off the coast of Florida for several days, coming close enough to land that at night the passengers could very easily see the lights of Miami. All this time, the captain of the St. Louis, Gustav Schroeder, was imploring the United States State Department and President Roosevelt for permission to disembark his passengers in Miami. But for whatever reason, that permission was denied. The St. Louis then sailed back across the Atlantic. A deal was brokered on the way over, allowing the refugees on board the St. Louis to disembark in one of four countries: England, France, Belgium, or Holland. My grandfather and uncle disembarked in France, no doubt at the time very pleased they at least were not in Germany. They were placed in a displaced persons camp outside Le Mans, where they remained for the next 10 weeks, after which September 1st, 1939 happened. The Second World War broke out, and my parents, my grandfather and uncle, were instantly transformed in the eyes of the French from displaced persons to enemy aliens, since France and Germany were now at war. My grandfather and uncle were transferred to what were, in all but name, concentration camps in the south of France, Camp Les Milles and Rivesaltes, and where they stayed for the next several years until August of 1942, when they were transported by way of Drancy to Auschwitz. My father's younger sister and mother and grandmother met similar fates, as did my mother's mother. So my parents were extraordinarily fortunate to have made it to this country and to make very good lives for themselves as musicians, given what had happened to the rest of their families. I called the book The Inextinguishable Symphony after a symphony by Carl Nielsen, the Danish composer, his Symphony No. 4, a wonderful piece of music I commend to your attention if you haven't yet discovered it. Carl Nielsen wrote his Fourth Symphony as a response to the First World War. He wrote it in 1916 and was just appalled at all of the destruction he saw around him. But Carl Nielsen was essentially an optimistic man, and he wrote at the head of the score that even if life on Earth should be destroyed by humanity, life would eventually return, even if it were plant life or animal life or bird life. Music is life, said Carl Nielsen, and like life, inextinguishable. Since the premiere of his Fourth Symphony in 1916, the Symphony No. 4 has always been known as Carl Nielsen's Inextinguishable Symphony. And as I write in the book, the Kulturbund Orchestra in Berlin was planning to perform the Nielsen Fourth in the fall of 1941, but was unable to since they were dissolved in September. But it has still struck me as being a wonderful metaphor for these incredibly courageous, and some would say, in retrospect, foolhardy artists who continued to make art for their fellow German Jews and to give the members of their community a brief respite during their performances from the increasing ugliness that was going on outside the theaters on the streets of Germany. Before I address any questions you might have, I would like to conclude by reading the last just couple of pages of the book. They go like this. Wednesday, November 10th, 1999. A cloudy, chilly afternoon in Oldenburg. So much time during the preparation of this book I have spent living in what British historian G.M. Trevelyan called that land of mystery, which we call the past. Today, as the century nears its end, the mystery reaches forward to embrace the present. 61 years after my grandfather Alex Goldschmidt marched through these streets at the point of a gun, the citizens of Oldenburg have gathered to retrace his steps. For more than a decade, a group of Oldenburgers has come together every year to commemorate the anniversary of that most shameful moment in their city's 650-year history. The march, which follows the exact route taken by the captive Jews and their Nazi guards, is Oldenburg's way of atoning for the sins of its forebears, its dramatically declared ritual of remembrance. My brother Peter and I have come to honor our father and grandparents by taking part in the march. We have been welcomed warmly, in particular by Oldenburg's mayor, Hiltrud Neidhart, and her husband, Roland, by Ali Zahedi, an Iranian-born writer and filmmaker, and by a young Lutheran pastor named Dietgard Dimitriadis. They are pleased that we have come all this way to join them. We are overwhelmed by their kindness and hospitality. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, about 300 people have gathered in the Pferdemarkt, the market square where Alex and his 42 fellow prisoners began their ordeal. After a few solemn words by one of this year's organizers, we begin to walk. The line of people stretches for more than 100 yards. Old folks, school children, mothers with baby carriages, young men pushing bicycles, a woman in a wheelchair. Two marchers carry a banner that reads, November 10th, 1938. Nothing is forgotten. No one is forgotten. In the whirl of emotions and sensations, I am struck by two things. Policemen, so unlike the police 61 years ago, assist us in our effort, stopping traffic at intersections and easing our way. And the silence. 300 people walk almost noiselessly through the streets. Pedestrians cease their conversations as we approach. Drivers in automobiles that have been stopped to let us pass wait silently, patiently enduring the traffic. It seems as if the entire city is taking part. We walk the cobblestone streets of the old city, pass within a block of the site of the Haus der Mode, my grandfather's store, emerge onto Elisabethstrasse where it borders the Schlossgarten. Suddenly the clouds part, and the late afternoon sun pours its benediction upon us through the golden trees. It is like a peaceful dream. But then we turn left, and the dream is over. The grim and ugly prison, its dirty red walls topped by razor wire, stands waiting today as it did for my grandfather. Its squat, unarguable presence is a shock, an almost palpable blow. The prison's heavy iron gate has been drawn back. Its courtyard stands open. I am painfully aware that I am about to cross its threshold to recreate that awful step when Alex Goldschmidt's life essentially ended. No. I notice that Pastor Dimitriadis is at my side. She has sensed my discomfort. She touches my arm and asks my grandfather's name. His name is Alex. She nods and moves on. Two brief speeches. Two teenage girls sing a Jewish folk song. The march is ended. My heart numb, I turn to find my brother Peter. But there again is Pastor Dimitriadis. She takes my hands and looks unblinkingly into my eyes. When Cain slew Abel, she says to me, God marked him with his brother's name so that all should see it. That mark has kept Abel's name alive across the generations. Those whom Germany killed have had their names kept alive by the mark with which God has touched my country. She smiles sadly and continues ever so softly. And that's the case with Alex. His name shall live forever. The pastor hugs me then, and I sob on her shoulder, crying for those poor people in their unmarked graves, the relatives I never knew and miss so much. Before I leave the city that cast out my grandfather and has now welcomed me back, I revisit the Oldenburg Archives, a modern glass and steel building no more than half a mile from the prison. The archivists show me a roster of Oldenburg's citizens. I direct them to the page marked Goldschmidt and inform them that Günther, son of Alex, has a son named Martin, who was married in October 1999. They eagerly write down names, addresses, dates of birth. Our family is not extinguished. Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. If any of you have questions, please come down to these microphones, which I guess are there for that very purpose, and I will attempt to answer them or address them.
Martin, I'm curious about reactions to the book with your father, with any further communication about this episode, having written about it. And I will tell you, if you haven't read this, it's nonfiction, but it reads like a novel. It's a marvelously written book. But more communication about it?
Well, speaking of community, I have had the great pleasure of speaking about the book in many locations across the country, and so many times I will be speaking with people afterwards, and people about my age will say to me, you know, there was a tree in our house too. I think a lot of people in their 40s and 50s who are children of people who survived those ordeals were equally aware that there was something going on that we were not supposed to talk about, or that we didn't talk about. And it's really been wonderful meeting so many people who understood what that metaphor was all about. But it's also been wonderful to meet people for whom the Kulturbund is a new information. Very few people knew about this incredible organization, and it's really been a great pleasure for me to bring that information to people. And the book has been translated into German, and next month I'm going to Germany to talk about the book at various places in Germany, including the new Jewish Museum in Berlin. And I'm very much looking forward to finding out what that reaction will be.
Did your parents contemplate Palestine when they thought to come here? Or was
they did not, and this sort of raises a question another question that has come up, and that has to do with my Jewish identity. Both of my parents were born Jewish. Both of them were born in Western Germany. My father in Oldenburg, my mother in Düsseldorf. Western German Jews have been assimilated, or had been assimilated for a number of years. Germany was the first country to grant full civil rights to its Jews, and many people in Germany who were Jewish felt German first and Jewish second, and that was certainly the case with both of my parents' families. My parents did not feel a particular Jewish affinity or affiliation. They did not think that Palestine would necessarily be the place to go. They had met this Mrs. Schneider, and that seemed like a wonderful opportunity to come to the United States. But I don't believe they ever contemplated going to Palestine. But one very interesting thing is that when I was growing up, I had really no idea that I was Jewish. My parents never talked about that. My father occasionally would refer to himself as being, quote, of Jewish background, unquote, and a few times he referred to himself as a so-called Jew. I didn't attend my first Seder until we had moved from St. Louis to Cleveland to Shaker Heights, which many of you know is a fairly Jewish neighborhood, and some friends invited me to my first Seder when I was 16. So imagine my surprise when I was in Oldenburg and in pawing through those archives that I just mentioned, and one of the archivists brought me a piece of paper. He said, "I think you'd be interested in this." It was my father was born in 1913, and this archivist brought me the rabbinical records from the fall of 1926. It was a record of my father's bar mitzvah. I immediately called my father and said, "You never told me you'd been bar mitzvahed. I thought you were a so-called Jew." And he professes not to remember being bar mitzvahed, which I think is an indication of the degree to which he has tried to suppress a lot of the pain of his past. I quote in the book some excerpts from a number of letters that my father received from his father when his father was in those camps in France. My parents arrived here in 1941. My grandfather and uncle were in the camps until August of 1942, and a number of letters made it over here in which my grandfather repeatedly says to his son, my father, "You must do whatever you can to get us out of here as fast as you can." And the very last letter that my father received from his father is dated June 9th, 1942, just a couple of months before he was taken away to Auschwitz. And this letter says to my father, "I have gone over with you a number of times the conditions under which we are living. Again, I implore you to do whatever you can to get us out of here. If you don't, it will be on your conscience." And my grandfather, I guess, was more right even than he knew. And my father, I think, has had to live with the guilt of not having saved his family. Not that there was anything, practically speaking, that he could have done, but with this indictment hanging over him, I think it was one of the reasons that my father gave up his flute and eventually sold furniture at Famous Bar in St. Louis for a number of years. It was, I think, his act of penance. Yes?
Actually, my question's changed now, after what you just said. Do you think your father's guilt over your grandfather's letter is the main reason why he didn't speak about the conditions in Nazi Germany, or were there other particular reasons that prevented your father from ever divulging to you the information that obviously you wanted to know?
Well, see, the interesting thing is that I didn't know I wanted to know it for many years. Again, it was this tree, this immense thing in the room that we never spoke about. And on one level or another, I was aware of it, but we just didn't talk about what had happened in Germany. Apparently, based on other people who are children of that generation, it was not that unusual for people of that generation to be silent about what had happened to them. It was, I mean, this sounds flippant, I do not mean it to be, but it was certainly the age before Oprah, when one did not talk about these things. One did not unburden oneself of one's private sorrows. One kept them in. One was more resolute than that. And secondly, there was a great deal of guilt and pain connected to all of that. And my father now says he wanted to spare my mother. That may have been a cop-out, I'm not sure. But as I say, it was not unusual for people of that generation to not speak of those days.
Would you say the catharsis or change in your father happened at the Jewish Holocaust Museum, or had it been a building thing, or was it a sudden thing, finally coming to terms with it?
I think he still hasn't completely come to terms with it. He's still, I'm afraid, and he's going to celebrate his 89th birthday in November, and I'm afraid if he lives to be 189, he will never quite put this sorrow away from him. But I think going to the Holocaust Museum and hearing the response of so many people and people who have read the book and so on, I think has helped reduce the sense of isolation that he felt. Again, I think he felt guilty. He felt that he had this terrible secret that nobody knew, nobody would understand. And when people said, well, we think we do understand, or at least in our way, we forgive you, I think that was very helpful to him, and he now finds it more easy to talk about the old days when before he wouldn't.
I'm sort of curious about the language. I know as a musician you've probably had to study German from that standpoint, but I'm also curious if you spoke German at home.
I studied German in high school for a couple of years, but my parents would only speak German if they didn't want my brother and me to know what they were talking about. For the most part, they spoke English, and I think I speak nur ein bisschen. I speak a little bit of German, but I think with a fairly good accent because I grew up hearing my parents'
And then
accents.
you spoke of the letters that were between your grandfather and your father. Presumably those were in German. And did you have to get someone to translate them?
Yes, I did. When I went to Germany, I traveled to Germany 3 times to do research for the book, and I luckily found some wonderful material and was able to bring it home with me. And I found a woman who works at ZDF German Television in Washington who translated those documents for me. And then I found, through my publisher, John Wiley & Sons, a woman who is a professional translator, and I sent her the letters to translate, and she did a wonderful job. Okay.
Can you say something about the comparison of expressing yourself through music and expressing yourself through language, through words?
Well, unlike my parents, I don't have the same facility with music. Hundreds of years ago, I played the French horn in high school, and I sang in the chorus of the Baltimore Opera Company, and I'm a very good whistler. But I've not really been a musician. But it is, I have to tell you, it has been incredibly satisfying to express all of this. And I hope very, very much that this is not my only book. I very much would like to write again. And there is a great deal of satisfaction in communicating and telling a story and reaching other people and making connections with other people.